While most wars have fairly mundane names, some wars get stuck with weird ones. There are 8 I know of which have always sounded strange to me. But are they really wars? What were they about? Is the weird name relevant? I'm going to briefly explain some of these. I figure you can always look these up further if you care. So, was this a war? Yes. This one started in 1832 in Mexico. A Frenchman, of course he was French, complained in a letter to the French king that the Mexican officials had raided his pastry shop, and he demanded that the Mexican government pay him reparations of 60,000 pesos. No one cared for a couple of years until this and a few other complaints made the French king demand 600,000 pesos worth of reparations for various damages to French interests. Mexico didn't pay, so the French launched a blockade of the east coast of Mexico, the coast with all the Europe trade. They also tried to capture the crucial port of Veracruz, which they did, so Mexico surrendered and promised to pay the 600,000 pesos. Then Mexico didn't pay again, but this war's over, so we don't care about that. Not really a war about pastry. I mean, the business owner could have owned a cheese shop or a white flag shop and the results would have been the same. The main point was that this Frenchman and several others saw reason to petition the French government for redress from Mexico. So was this a war? Yes. The name of this war refers to several football matches between El Salvador and Honduras. 3 football matches, over qualification for the 1970 FIFA World Cup. El Salvador would go on to win and successfully qualify for FIFA 1970, so I suppose that's a thing. These matches were met with several violent clashes between fans due to already existing tensions between the 2 countries. These tensions revolved around immigration and land reform and borders and wealth inequality and that sort of usual stuff. On the same day as the final football match, El Salvador cut diplomatic ties with Honduras. A few weeks later, El Salvador bombed and invaded Honduras. The Salvadoran invasion began to stall around the capital of Honduras, Tegucigalpa. Then the rest of the world said, hey, don't do that, and El Salvador stopped doing that. The war only lasted around 100 hours. So was it about football? Well, no. It was contemporary with a football rivalry, but when El Salvador cut ties with Honduras, they made this statement, which includes words like genocide and claims that they are owed reparations. These tensions still exist today, even though the 1970 FIFA World Cup was almost 50 years ago and was won by some other country I've never heard of. So was this one a war? Yes. Robert Jenkins was a British smuggler in the 18th century. That's the one with the American Revolution, the invention of the steam engine, and Mozart. Jenkins was caught on a smuggling run by the Spanish Coast Guard in the Americas. The Spanish then cut the ear off Jenkins and gave it to him to show his fellow British what the Spanish do to smugglers. Jenkins presented his ear to the king in 1731 and complained about the Spanish, but no one really cared at this point. Fast forward another 7 years to 1738, and the British were kind of up for a war with the Spanish, so they got Jenkins to come out to the House of Commons and do his bit about his ear. This was used as an example of how the Spanish needed to be taught a lesson, so there was a war, and the fighting took place in some parts of the world which aren't really that important. Eventually the rest of Europe went to war over the Austrian succession, and the War of Jenkins' Ear just merged into that wider conflict. Now, I'm not sure I'd say that this war was specifically about this one incident with the ear, but it was definitely presented as the main incident causing the outrage which justified the conflict. Of course, you can always say that the real cause of war was the tensions between the 2 countries, or the Treaty of Versailles, or just because New Zealand had all that really attractive land right next door without a sizable army or binding defense treaty with the US. But I'm just going to say this war was because of an ear. So, was this a war? Maybe more of a border skirmish. Officially it's referred to as an incident, so I don't know. This happened between Greece and Bulgaria in 1925. These countries didn't really like each other much because there was, that whole World War I thing like 7 years ago. A Greek captain stationed on the Bulgarian border was chasing his escaped dog when it ran across the Bulgarian border. He was shot and killed by the Bulgarian border guards. Bulgaria was like, oh shit, sorry. Greece was like, you need to apologize and pay us reparations. Bulgaria was like, don't run your soldiers into our country and we won't kill them. And Greece invaded and occupied the town of Petrich. This threatened international war and Europe was like, please, no, stop, no more wars, we can't take it. So the League of Nations got them to stop it a day after the invasion. Now the real question we all want to know is, was the dog okay? So was this incident because of the stray dog? Yes it was. It's hard to imagine conflict breaking out without being triggered by some sort of incident, and the conflict was mostly limited to the areas and objectives surrounding the shooting of the Greek captain. So, was this one a war? Yes. This one's a bit misleading though. The oaken bucket belonged to the Italian city-state of Bologna in 1325. This bucket was stolen by some soldiers from another city-state, Modena, and taken back as a trophy. The key point though was that the bucket had also been filled with, I've seen loot and booty, but I haven't really been able to find any good sources about the contents. But we can assume that it probably contained something like money, jewelry, other valuables, or even the hopes and dreams of all the countless peasants who inevitably get murdered, raped and dispossessed during every conflict in this period, and most other periods. Maybe it would be more apt to call it the war of all that fucking money and valuables those bastards stole from us. Anyway, some fighting happened and there was an actual battle. Modena won and they got to keep the bucket, which they hung up in the town hall, and presumably they got to keep its contents. So this was part of a wider conflict in Italy at the time, between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. These two factions represented both yeah, Emperor, and boo, Emperor, which was also yeah, Pope. A good way to think of this is that the Modenese and the Bolognese had kind of been at war for ages anyway, but didn't really care enough to go kill each other most of the time. Regardless, you can hardly say that the bucket was really the cause or objective of the war. So was this a war? Well, not really, more like a dispute. It's never officially called a war. This one was actually 3 wars. We'll call them Cod War 1, Cod War 2, and Cod War 3. These disputes were over cod fishing rights in the North Atlantic. All 3 wars were between the United Kingdom and Iceland, during the 50s and 60s and 70s. Iceland used to have a lot of fish. It still has quite a lot now, but many of them have decided to go away forever over the last 100 years or so. Fishermen from various European countries had been fishing in the North Atlantic for hundreds of years, sometimes right up to the coast of Iceland. However, in the 1950s, Iceland and the rest of the world started defining territorial waters, claiming areas often fished by British and other European trawlers. Cod War 1 began in 1958 when Iceland announced it would extend its territorial waters from 4 nautical miles to 12 nautical miles. A nautical mile is a bit less than 2 kilometers. In response, the British said that their ships would keep fishing in the claimed territories, but with a naval escort. NATO, of which both countries were members, disagreed with Iceland's territorial waters extension, but Iceland was pretty strategically important during the Cold War. Much arguing was done, trawlers got chased by coast guards, a few boats rammed each other and some warning shots were fired, but when Iceland threatened to leave NATO over the incident, negotiations led to a resolution. Iceland got its waters, but the UK was allowed limited fishing rights for a limited time. The two countries also agreed not to be dicks about it in the future. Cod War 2 was over 10 years in the future, when Iceland and the UK were dicks about it again. Iceland decided that in 1972 it would begin enforcing an exclusive economic zone of 50 nautical miles. British and European trawlers kept fishing and the Royal Navy hung around again. This time, the Icelandic Coast Guard took to cutting the trawling nets. There was again lots of chasing, threatening, and ramming. This time someone died when the ship he was on was rammed. Iceland threatened to leave NATO and close the military bases in Iceland. An agreement was made, and again limited access was given to the British temporarily in the disputed area. The agreement expired in 1975. Cod War 3 began in 1975, when the Icelandic extended their exclusive economic zone to 200 nautical miles, the international standard. Lots of threats, chasing, net cutting and ramming. Again, NATO membership was called into question. NATO bases in Iceland were threatened with closure, and Iceland even cut diplomatic ties with the UK at one point. Again, an agreement was reached where Iceland got its new borders and the UK temporarily got limited fishing rights in the disputed area. All 3 of these wars were definitely about cod. The key issue for the British was the preservation of their fishing interests off the Icelandic coast. So, was this a war? No, this one was pretty much just a border dispute with a bit of mobilization. This was between the US and the British in 1859. Just over a decade earlier, they had decided where in the Oregon country the USA stopped and Canada began, but thanks to some less than clear wording, weren't really sure about who owned these islands, and both Canadians and Americans lived on the islands. The issue started when an American shot a pig belonging to a Canadian for eating his crops. This escalated as the British and Americans began sending military forces to attempt to control the area, but neither the British nor the Americans wanted to initiate hostilities. In the end, the conflict was de-escalated because, well, the British didn't want a war over a tiny part of Canada, and the US had some other stuff to worry about. The border dispute was eventually resolved in 1872, and the British went home. This was definitely sparked by the pig incident. However, it was obvious that there was a border dispute which underpinned the whole conflict, and could have escalated out of any other random incident. So, was this one a war? Holy crap, yes, Jesus Christ. So for those of you who don't know, this is an emu. It's a large dinosaur which is native to Australia. This war took place in 1932 during the height of the Great Depression. Australian agriculture had already been suffering when a large band of nomadic emus began ravaging farmland in Western Australia. In response, the Commonwealth of Australia declared a Vernichtungskrieg against the raiding emus, and mobilised the detachment of the Royal Australian Artillery, armed with machine guns. Unfortunately, the emus were well prepared for a confrontation with the main Australian forces, employing guerrilla tactics and dispersing into small units so that the Australians were unable to bring their superior firepower against the whole enemy force, while the emus also enjoyed decisively lower costs in material, fuel, and ammunition. The emus were also reported as having remarkable resilience to the Australian weaponry, being still able to conduct interference operations even after having been wounded several times. In the end, the Australian forces had to retire from the conflict without having accomplished any of their strategic objectives. So this war was because of the emus. Fuck emus. So, those were some oddly named wars. Watch my other videos.